Hi guys. So the former Prime Minister and Labour leader Gordon Brown spoke to Sky News about Scottish independence. So the first question he received from their interviewer, Sophie Ridge, was, do you believe the Scottish people will vote to leave the Union in another referendum? So let's hear what he had to say.
No, I don't think so. I think if there was a referendum, we'd win it and Scotland would stay in the United Kingdom, but it's going to be a hard battle.
Okay, I wish he would have gone into a bit more detail here, but he hasn't. He just said, yes, we would win it, but it'd be a hard battle. Why do you think you would win it, Gordon? Now, I've said before, opinion polls are not scientific. Opinion polls are not the best tool to use to gauge public opinion or how people would actually vote in an election or in a referendum. But consistent polling over the last number of months has shown support for independence. So to say that, yes, we would win it, okay, you'd need to explain why you think the Unionists would win it. But he doesn't explain that.
Because people are frustrated, they're fed up, not just in Scotland.
Sorry, and now what he's going to do is he's going to explain why people would vote to leave the Union instead.
But in the regions of England, in Wales, and I see a sense growing right across the whole of the United Kingdom that people feel in the regions and the nations, they're not being listened to, they're not being consulted. Westminster, Whitehall is out of touch. And that's why I think we've got to say that at the end of this COVID crisis, we're going to review the way we govern ourselves, the way we manage affairs, whether it's public health or how we manage the economy, recession, industry, employment. And I think we're going to have to get a far better balance between the powers that the nations and regions hold, and I'm talking about the areas around Manchester, Liverpool, Newcastle, Bristol, London, of course, all the different parts of the United Kingdom. They need far more powers of economic initiative, and the centre will have to admit that it cannot do everything itself and that centralisation is not working in the way that it could.
I agree 100% with him in this regard. There is a concentration of power at the moment in Westminster. Boris Johnson is not reaching out to the councils, to cities, of course, to Scotland and Wales, not one bit, because he doesn't give a crap about them. He only cares about concentrating power around him, around his government. And, you can, when it came to Brexit, we came to the legal system, it's the same situation. Now, the problem here is that Gordon Brown is talking about, yes, we need to reform things, we need to change things, but you can't. You're not in power. The Labour Party are not anywhere near power at the moment. Any type of reform could possibly come after 2024, unless there's some major upset. But you're talking about a few years down the road before you can actually reform things. And I don't think there is that time to wait to convince the Scottish people in particular to vote against independence.
You clearly want more devolution, more powers to the region. Boris Johnson reportedly said there recently in a Zoom call with Conservative MPs that devolution has been a disaster. Do you think he's right?
Well, he's completely out of touch. And
you should have said, no, he's wrong. It's not a disaster. It was a success. Actually, I understand that, see, Gordon Brown is in a particular position, and I would actually love to know Gordon Brown's personal opinion on Scottish independence. Because officially, and as ex-leader of the Labour Party, he has to take the position of supporting the Union. But personally, I'd like to know what his opinions are. But anyway, if he says that devolution has been a success, what he's doing is he's putting the Labour Party in a difficult position, because he's saying, well, look, the next question was, oh, well, if it's a success, it's thanks to the SNP because they have been doing such a great job. And that's not helpful to the Labour Party in Scotland. If he does criticise devolution and say, well, it hasn't been working very well, then he's putting himself in a difficult position, because he was supportive of devolution. And his colleague, of course, and former leader Tony Blair were the architects of this. So he can't criticize it, but he can't also support it. Now, I think he should say, look, it has been a success. I don't agree with the SNP on what they're doing, for political reasons. But for me, devolution has been a success.
And that's why he is not popular in Scotland. But neither would he be popular in Wales, where people want devolution to work. And you can see from Andy Burnham in Manchester, Steve Rotherham in Liverpool, Jamie Driscoll, the mayor of Newcastle, Marvin in Bristol, Sadiq Khan in London, that they're all saying, and Sheffield, of course, with Dan Jarvis, they're all saying they need more power to be able to make decisions closer to home. And there's something quite wrong about the British Constitution now, that we have a multinational state, we have regions with a great deal of different needs and different traditions and different cultures and different desires. But this government has not found a way of cooperating with them, of consulting them, of working with them. And there seems to be no formal mechanisms in place by which the mayors or the first ministers can actually talk to the prime minister or talk to the leading cabinet ministers. And this really matters because we failed on test and track as far as I can see. We were too slow on testing. There's a huge standoff about the local lockdowns. We've got a huge issue coming up on vaccination where it's great what the scientists have done, but unless we have local systems of delivery that are coordinated with the training of people and the supply and, of course, the logistics to get supplies there, then that vaccination thing will not work the way it should. And it's a huge task ahead of us. And so the British way of governing has got to change if we're going to meet the needs and aspirations of people in all parts of the country.
But also a bigger issue, I think, which is he's not alluding to, but I think is important to remember, is that Boris Johnson has been fighting with the local mayors because he disagrees with them politically in many cases. The King in the North, for example. But I think going forward, there is a risk also, now that this vaccine has arrived and it's going to be, a logistical nightmare, there is also a risk that maybe conservative voting areas will get the vaccine first and Labour supporting areas will get it later. I wouldn't put it past Boris Johnson and his government to do such a cynical thing. At
the same time, though, is there an argument that further devolution does put you further along the path to independence? You wrote in the New Statesman recently, it was naive to think we could create strong Scottish, Welsh, Northern Irish and regional decision-making bodies and automatically expect people to feel more British as a result. Equally, it was naive not to anticipate that devolution could create a megaphone for intensifying resentment. So do you think the last Labour government was naive?
Well, the word there is automatic. We should not have expected that automatically everything would be okay. You've got to build systems where you cooperate between the different administrations, where there's some form of coordination and collaboration, where people are prepared to work together. And that clearly has not happened. We tried it. To be fair to what we were trying to do, I wanted joint ministerial committees and everything else to work, but this is not...
But what is the problem with these countries becoming independent? What's wrong with Scottish independence? Like, Gordon Brown, I understand he's a unionist, but he should say, look, devolution has been a success. Has it led to a stronger voice for independence? Yes, it has. But it's not because of devolution, it's because of how the government have acted. Now, is there a problem with these countries becoming, Scotland in particular, becoming independent? Well, he should basically say, well, if the Scottish people want to become independent, that's their decision. If part of the reason they want to become independent because of how badly Westminster has operated, well, that's partly our responsibility and it's partly Boris Johnson's responsibility and the Tories' responsibility. Scottish independence isn't something that's just sprung up overnight in the last couple of years. It's been growing over the last number of decades. And for example, Ian Blackford raised the issue of the war in Iraq and how it was not supported in Scotland. This was under Tony Blair's watch. It's not something that has just appeared with Boris Johnson. I think that's very important for people to remember. Yes, it's very popular at the moment. Nicola Sturgeon is pushing it quite hard. But it's not something new. It has been around for a considerable amount of time. And it's not just the SNP. There are a myriad of groups who have started up to push for independence, and they're not the SNP. Some of them are quite critical of the SNP. But to say that devolution doesn't lead to, or shouldn't lead to, independence, I don't think that's a problem. If that's the natural end of devolution, then so be it. You should be able to convince people to stay in the Union with reasonable arguments. Not because, well, that wasn't our decision at the end of the day. And what's the alternative? The alternative would be, well, we shouldn't have given people independence we shouldn't have given people devolution, or we shouldn't have given people in their areas more control. Well, you've just argued at the beginning of this interview why people should have more control.
Not working. They have not been meeting under the Conservative government other than on Brexit. And you can talk to every mayor and they will say, and Conservative ones will say as well as Labour ones, that they do not feel that they are let into the discussions that matter to their own areas, and therefore we fall down.
You mentioned at the beginning of the interview that if there was another referendum on Scottish independence, that you think the campaign to stay in the Union would win. At the same time, though, polls are showing now a majority for independence. And if the SNP do win a majority at next year's Holyrood elections, do you think they'll have a mandate for another referendum?
I don't think people want a referendum now. And
Sorry, I don't know why it cut off for a moment. I don't know why people want a there is a referendum. No, I don't. Let me hear what he said again. Just apologies for that. I don't know why it cut off.
I don't think people want a referendum now, and
I don't think people want a referendum now. Yes, they do. As I said before, it's not just the SNP, it's other movements in Scotland who are pushing for a referendum. There are marches organised for a referendum. If you're saying which people? Most people who are asked, do you want a referendum? Yes, most people do. And which way would you vote? Majority would vote for independence.
The question is whether you should have a referendum. You could, of course, have a referendum if you wanted to, but should you have a referendum? And the answer is no, I don't think you should have a referendum at this stage when we're dealing with a pandemic. Sorry, we're dealing with, but look, an election in May, the SNP want a referendum in 2021. We've got to deal with the recession. Unemployment is...
This is the same argument that Boris Johnson and the Tories are making. Look, we have this pandemic at the moment. You shouldn't be talking about a referendum. It's too much trouble. Okay, but I know Gordon Brown didn't support Brexit, but Boris Johnson is saying, well, we need to get Brexit done at the same time as we're doing this pandemic. There was an opportunity, and I talked about it on the channel, how Boris Johnson could have asked for an extension to the transition period to get the COVID sorted out and then deal with Brexit. But he said, no, we can deal with Brexit and a pandemic at the same time. Gordon Brown is suggesting that, throwing in a referendum, that, what are the problems? What are the logistic problems of having a referendum? I don't think they're that enormous. And he's saying, no, throwing in a referendum would be just creating more problems. This is a weak argument. It's basically saying, look, maybe we should suspend elections. Why shouldn't we suspend elections if that's the case? No, well, elections are necessary, but referendums are not.
Rising. We've got to vaccinate people in Scotland and perhaps a second round. We don't know whether there's going to be a third or fourth wave of this disease.
But this is a completely separate issue. I'm quite disappointed with Gordon Brown here, because he's using ridiculous arguments that the Conservative Party have been using. Look, we have this pandemic, we should focus on that. Everything has to come to a grinding halt because we have to deal with the pandemic, apart from Brexit.
The idea you can have a referendum during the first 12 months of the next year seems to me quite unrealistic and is a sign that the nationalists are really out of touch with the...
But you notice that he didn't say whether they would have a mandate. He said they shouldn't have a referendum. He didn't say whether they would have a mandate for a referendum.
Priorities of the Scottish people.
I wonder how much you think the personalities come into it as well. There's a 100-point difference between Nicola Sturgeon's approval ratings in Scotland and Boris Johnson's. Hers is plus 49, his is minus 57. If Boris...
Minus 57. You know, a rotten haggis would have a higher approval rating than Boris Johnson.
Boris Johnson is the face of the campaign to stay. You're going to lose, aren't you?
I think Boris Johnson...
Gordon, just say yes. Just be honest and say, look, Boris Johnson is a disaster. Yes, if Boris Johnson is the face, we're frigged.
has got to do something to show that he cares about Scotland, but he's also going to do it for Wales, and he's also going to do it for...
Then you're going to be waiting a long time. If Boris Johnson has to demonstrate that he cares about, you know, people who are not called Boris Johnson, I'm sorry, Gordon, you're going to have to wait a long, long time. Maybe forever. If you're... never mind Scotland. Never mind caring about people in Scotland. Never mind caring about people in England. If you're asking Boris Johnson to care about people who are not called Boris Johnson, I think you're barking up the wrong tree, mate.
For the regions of England, where, quite frankly, some of his statements have gone down badly as well. You know, as a Prime Minister, and I found this, you've got to spend time bringing people together. In the end, it's you, the Prime Minister, that's got to try to...
Bringing people together? He can't even keep his whole family together.
Unite the country. You can't rely on different parts of the country coming together automatically. You've got to bring people together. And he has no forum in which he consults the people who are making decisions about this virus in the regions. No permanent forum. There is no constitutional working...
What you're doing, Gordon Brown, is you're setting the bar way too high. Boris Johnson is incompetent. He doesn't actually consider listening to other people. He doesn't consider their opinions. He doesn't consider people outside his bubble. And you want him to listen to the Scottish people or the Welsh? People who haven't gone to Eton? This is a fundamental problem here. Boris Johnson is the worst Prime Minister at the worst possible time. You know, Theresa May was a terrible Prime Minister. She was weak when it came to standing up to the likes of the ERG. But she would be much better to deal with the Scottish question or to deal with the pandemic. Imagine Theresa May in charge. She wouldn't have surrounded herself with idiots like Boris Johnson has. And she would have reached out, perhaps not to the same extent as perhaps Tony Blair or Gordon Brown would, but I think she would treat the Scottish people with a bit more respect than Boris Johnson would. And the approval rating that Theresa May would have would be much better than Boris Johnson has. So Boris Johnson is probably one of the greatest motivators for independence at the moment. He's a disaster. He shouldn't be any... The more he speaks about Scottish independence, about Scotland, about the SNP, I think their support for independence goes up 1 or 2 percentage points.
Relationship that is actually operational between him and Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. And he's really got to think about that. And I don't want it to be an issue of personalities. I want it to be about how we approach the future of the United Kingdom, because...
I'm sorry to interrupt him, but unfortunately that's not how politics works. People don't vote according to policies. They vote according to personalities. Why did people who are working class and poor vote for Boris Johnson back last December, 1 year ago? Why did they vote for him? Some of them said because he's a funny guy. Some people voted for him because they wanted him to get Brexit done. Because he's a lad. Because he's a bit of a fool. A bit of a clown. Now they're having buyer's remorse. But you can't dismiss personality. Boris Johnson has a terrible personality, but many people bought into it.
People are really fed up. A lot of people feel that they are treated as second-class citizens. They feel that some of the decisions over the lockdowns were made without taking into account the needs of the North in particular. And I really think we've got to face up to this. You know, as a Prime Minister, you've also got to be 2 steps ahead of events. And this is...
Boris is 2 sofas behind events.
An issue that's coming down the tracks. Yes, we've got to get vaccination out there, and I do applaud the scientists that have made this possible. Yes, we've got to get the economy back working again, but to do these things properly in the future, to manage public health and to manage the economy better, we've got to have a better way of working together. We've got to have a better way of showing that joint working can bring better results.
Yeah.
And that's all he has to say on Scottish independence in Scotland. I'm quite disappointed with Gordon Brown because he hasn't actually presented any arguments for the union. He's presented arguments against it. How, people are tired. People in Scotland in particular are fed up with Boris Johnson and his government, and how they're trying to concentrate power within Westminster, taking it away from Scotland. And not just in Scotland, of course, people in the north of England in particular as well are tired of Boris Johnson's government and feel abandoned and feel that there's a conflict between central government and their local governments, which is not positive, not the way to go ahead, especially during the middle of a pandemic. Let me know in the comment section, guys, what you think about this interview, and as always, your comments are greatly appreciated. Thanks a lot.